Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Today I will be discussing Module 6 of our syllabus, which is about attitude and attitude change. Okay, so right now we are in independent learning mode, and I hope that you've read the book chapter, but as a supplement, I'm also doing this short lecture on attitude and attitude change. As you might have read in the book, attitude has a lot to do when it comes to um, advertisements, because advertisements are exactly designed to do that, are exactly designed to target our attitudes. And if you're wondering if advertisements are effective, meaning to say, can they change our attitude? I suppose that would be, I suppose one can say that it is or they are effective. Why would I say that they're effective? Because they exist. No? I suppose these companies who are advertising their products to us would not continue doing so, would not continue spending a lot of money advertising their products if there aren't gains in profit or revenue, out of these advertisements. Um, and so one clear example for is as cited in the book, is the case of cigarettes. In Not until the early 20th century, did advertisements for cigarettes began targeting women, because before only men smoke, and if you're a lady who smokes, you are frowned upon. So they cigarette companies knew that this is a demographic, a population that they can still tap. It's a market that they can still tap, and so they began advertising cigarettes, targeting women. And by 1955, um, there are twice as many males as female smokers in America, at least. And by 2004, although the number of people who are smoking have drastically declined, you can see that women, in terms of percentage, are not very far behind compared to the percentage of men who are smoking. But before we continue, let's talk about what attitudes are. If I ask you now, what is your attitude? How would you answer? How would you answer such? Maybe you can pause your video and consider my question. What is your attitude, or what are your attitudes? And maybe you can, if you like, you can write it down in a piece of paper. So go ahead, think about it. You can pause this video, and after you've done thinking about it, I wonder how you answer that particular question, because that particular question is actually not necessarily answerable. You cannot answer the question, what is your attitude? Your response to the question, what is your attitude, should have been another question, and the question should have been, sir, attitude towards what? Because we really cannot talk about our attitude not unless we know the object of the attitude. And that's a thing about attitude. So as you can see here, attitudes refer to our evaluations of people, objects, and ideas. So attitudes do not exist in a vacuum. Every time that we talk about a certain attitude, it's always directed towards somebody. Our attitude towards a politician, our attitude towards a classmate, or an object, our attitude towards a certain brand of cell phone, our attitude towards a brand of ice cream, or ideas, our attitude towards feminism, our attitude towards democracy. So attitudes unlike traits which can sort of exist independently, independent of any object. Like for example, I can say a bunch of traits that I think I have, or at least um, what some personality trait test tells me. Attitudes um, is always anchored on something. No? And to simplify it, when we talk about attitudes, it's basically a case of liking or disliking something. No? It all boils down to that. No? It's an evaluation. And when we evaluate people, objects, or ideas, it boils down as to whether we like or dislike somebody, we like or dislike a certain object, we like or dislike a certain idea. So if you say that that seems to be a good idea, it seems to be a good idea to invest in this certain business, then that is your attitude towards the idea of investing in a certain business. Okay. So I'll name a bunch of um, uh, uh, objects, group people, ideas, and at the back of your head, now think about whether you like them or dislike them. Or it might also be possible that you don't have any strong dislike or liking towards that particular object. You seem to be neutral towards that object. All right, so here we go. BTS, coffee, ice cream, um, Toyota, uh, car, iPhone, um, Chernobyl. um, who else? Uh, Lenny Robredo. Okay. So, do you like or dislike those things? Now, how did you feel about those things? How did you feel about those persons? Do you have was your reaction immediate? Did you immediately say, I like this or I dislike that? Um, I suppose the intensity varies. Like for example, some for BTS fans probably had a strong reaction to when I said BTS. No? So that kind of reaction, which is a sort of a byproduct of our evaluations of these things, at least the things that I've mentioned, are part of our attitude towards those things. All right. Now, attitudes actually have three components, and later on we will break them down and discuss them more thoroughly. So, attitudes can be affective, and this can be demonstrated through our emotional reactions to something or someone. Of course, attitudes are not always effective. We can like something without loving it or without having a strong emotional attachment to it. Attitudes can also be cognitive, meaning to say the basis of our liking or disliking something or someone is on a certain set of arguments or a certain set of beliefs or cognitions about that specific individual or specific object. And sometimes, if we don't have a strong affective or cognitive attitude towards an object or a person or an idea, uh, you know, our attitudes can also be demonstrated by how we behave or act towards these individuals, objects, or ideas. So, meron ding behavioral component ang attitude. Okay. So, for example, if I say BTS, probably some of the BTS fans have a strong affective or a stronger emotional, positive or negative emotional reaction towards BTS. Most likely, behaviorally, you show your attitudes by watching over and over again their music videos, um, 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 having to play their songs on Spotify constantly. Cognitively, probably you also think about their kind of music, how their music. I mean, if you have specific cognitions about their music, you like their lyrics. Do you understand their lyrics, or do you like the beat? Do you like the fact that um, that their music is a good accompaniment to your workout, stuff like that. So it can also be meron ding cognitive component ng ating attitudes. No? Or yeah, so think of other examples, no, and sort of evaluate like how, whether you like or dislike these things at an affective level, at a cognitive level, and behaviorally, what do you do um, in reference to those to that evaluation? Okay. Um, okay. So here are some examples. The attitude about cars that can be effective. You can feel excitement about getting a new car, for those of you who had that particular experience. Or it can also be, behavioral, the act of trying out the car, or probably the act of buying the car itself, is a demonstration of a certain positive evaluation of the car, or looking at pictures of the car, online. Pwede ring merong cognitive reaction, admiring the hybrid engine and fuel efficiency, believing in the suspension system, etc., etc. Okay. Now, where do attitudes come from? When we talk about traits, now there is some evidence that traits, or at least our temperament, which serves as the foundation of the traits that we will eventually have, they have some genetic component. But what about attitudes? Is there evidence that that attitudes have some kind of hereditary basis or genetic basis? Based on some, it's questionable. What they've learned is that in twin studies, identical twins who were raised, so they looked for identical twins and fraternal twins. Of course, identical twins share the same genetic makeup, right? While fraternal twins do not share the same genetic makeup. And specifically, they look for twins who were raised separately. And what they've learned is that identical twins share more attitudes, have the same or have similar likes and dislikes compared to fraternal twins. So identical twins who were raised separately might have similar attitude towards jazz music. Both of them might like jazz, despite the fact that they were raised in different families. However, there's no convincing evidence to point out that there is such a thing as a jazz loving gene or a BTS loving gene. Wala naman siguro, no? But what they argue possibly is that our genetics influence our attitudes indirectly, through temperament in our personality. So it might be that our genes contribute to our temperament. Are we easygoing? Are we active? Are we difficult? No. They also contribute to our possibly intelligence or traits. And these temperaments, traits, or even intelligence might predispose us to like or dislike certain things. So yun yung kanilang sort of indirect argument as to why we are observing seeming similarities in attitudes towards specific objects among among identical twins. Where else? Another source of attitude, of course, is based on our experience. No, of course, growing up, we have we have certain experiences, and these experiences, through through um, models of learning, like for example, conditioning, classical conditioning or operant conditioning, might make us sort of attribute certain liking or disliking towards certain objects, which we will discuss eventually later on. Okay. Attitudes are not equally the same. Different. It seems that different objects, we tend to have different different attitude towards them. Although for the most part, attitudes have affective, cognitive, and behavioral components. Some attitudes are more affective, some attitudes are more cognitive, while some attitudes are more behavioral. Okay. So some attitudes are cognitively based. So what are they? These are attitudes that are based primarily on people's beliefs about the properties of an object. Sometimes our attitudes are based primarily on relevant facts. For example, you like a certain car because you can go on many kilometers on it per liter of gasoline. You like the safety features of a certain car. So those are liking the car because of those things, because of their features. That is clearly a cognitively based attitude. Typically, we have cognitively based attitudes towards objects that are utilitarian, meaning to say, my gamit. Typically these are objects that we use. Although of course it's not surprising to have an effective effective attitude towards a car, especially if the car is really the model that you love. But typically for objects that we use, more often than not, our attitude towards them are more cognitively based. Okay, so yeah. Sometimes attitudes can be affectively based. So an attitude based. So this is an attitude based more on people's feelings and values than their beliefs about the nature of values, than on their beliefs about the nature of the object of the attitude. Sometimes, even if there are certain things that are not useful, sometimes even if we know that a certain car doesn't have the features that are optimal, we can still have a strong attitude towards them, especially if what we care about is how these things make us feel. So sometimes we simply like a car regardless of how many miles to how many kilometers to liter it gets. We simply love it because of its aesthetic, perhaps. Occasionally, we even feel great about something or someone in spite of having negative beliefs about this particular individual. So some attitudes are more affectively based. Okay. So affectively based attitudes don't come from examining facts. They come more from values, our belief system, our morals. Like for example, perhaps we have certain attitudes towards, let's say for example, premarital sex, which can be informed by our religious beliefs or morals, or we have, affectively based attitudes towards towards a certain brand of ice cream, because of the sensory reaction that we get from eating that kind of ice cream, or it can also be based on aesthetic reaction. We strongly, di ba yung mga sometimes we strongly like a bag, for example, even if it's not very useful, you really can't put a lot of things in the bag, but sometimes you like the bag because of the brand, that you have some kind of brand loyalty, or you're in love with the brand, and it just looks good on you. And yun nga, sometimes we are conditioned to uh, to have an effectively positive evaluation of something. Conditioning. Okay. So I'm not going to discuss classical conditioning and operant conditioning here, because I suppose you have some kind of background of what classical conditioning and what operant conditioning is. Just know that some of our affective attitudes might be a product of this classical conditioning. In the example in the book, if you're familiar with mothballs, some people like the smell of mothballs, and they have a positive affective attitude towards the smell of mothballs. Yung para sa ipis, no? And why is that so? Probably it's associated with somebody who is dear to them. Like for example, they associate the smell of mothballs with their departed grandparent who they love so much. So that might be the case. Okay. Operant conditioning, sometimes we also dislike something because we had experience, and in the past, we have experienced, for example, punishment, for doing something, and from then on we had a negative affective attitude towards that particular behavior, because in the past we were punished for doing that. So operant conditioning can also play a role in the development of our affective attitudes, affectively based attitudes. Okay. Affectively based attitudes are similar in the sense that all of them are a result of, not a result rather, of rational examination. They're not governed by logic, and they're often linked to values, or the things that we consider as important. And lastly, some attitudes are more behaviorally based. So an attitude that is based on observations of how one behaves towards the object. And this is something that we have discussed in the past. In the past, when we talked about the understanding the self, we've talked about the social perception theory, and sometimes when one way of knowing the self is by observing what we do, and when is this true? Especially when our attitude is weak or ambiguous, we're not really sure whether we like or dislike something, and so we consider our past behavior. How do I behave around or towards this particular idea, object, or person? And if we find that in the past, we seem to behave positively towards this individual object or idea, then we figure that we might have a positive attitude towards those. And that because we're basing our evaluation of something based on how we reacted towards them in the past, no, then that makes it as a behaviorally based attitude. Okay. Attitudes, interestingly, can also be implicit. No? Um, when we talk about attitudes, we think of attitudes as something that we are consciously aware of. We're consciously aware that we like something or we dislike something. But those kinds of attitudes are specifically what we refer to as explicit attitudes. No? Attitudes that we consciously endorse and can easily report. But can we have an attitude, a liking or disliking that we're not completely aware of? According to social psychology, it's quite possible, and we refer to these as implicit attitudes, or attitudes that are involuntary, uncontrollable, and sometimes unconscious. Okay. So it's possible that so well, the example here, of course, which we can't necessarily relate to, no, would be about races. No? So for example, Sam, who is a white middle class college student, genuinely believes that all races are equal and abhors racial bias. No? So this is Sam's explicit attitude. No? So consciously, he is very accommodative, no, of all races, and in fact, Sam signed a petition in favor of affirmative action policies for all races, or promoting racial equality. However, Sam has grown in a culture in which there are many negative stereotypes about minority groups, and Sam might not be aware of it, but possibly deep within him, he has some negative ideas that may affect him, no? As evidenced by when Sam is around African Americans, he may automatically feel uncomfortable. He may sort of impulsively feel uneasy. And yeah, so that is Sam's implicit implicit attitude. And if you're wondering, can they coexist? Yes, they can. No, you can verbally say that you like something, but deep within you, even if the fact that you're saying that, I have no qualms with this, I have no problem with this, but the way our body reacts, not to certain objects, might speak about, our uh, implicit attitudes. Like for example, you might say that I love all animals. I'm an animal lover, but when you're and nobody, and because you're an animal lover, you wouldn't say I hate snakes. In fact, you might say that I think snakes are gorgeous. No, they are magnificent. But how would you react if you're standing right beside a snake? Mandidiri ka ba? Matatakot ka ba? No. So that would speak about, no, our implicit attitude towards the snake. No? So parang implicitly, baka anyway, logical naman, no, na matakot ka sa ahas. No, because, no, alam natin na poisonous siya. So there. No? So attitudes can be explicit, and it's quite possible that we have some attitudes that we're not even aware of, and parang our body is reacting towards some objects without us knowing. All right. Now, a good question would be, because attitudes are evaluations of people, objects, ideas, and whatnot, do they also predict um, behavior na towards these objects? One might say, I mean, it, I, you wouldn't be wrong to think that attitudes have something to do with the way we behave. In fact, we have some. It was already mentioned that attitudes now have a behavioral component to it, and that some attitudes are more behaviorally based now than cognitively based or affectively based. However, the relationship between attitude and behavior is a bit tricky. It's not that straightforward. If we always behaviorally respond to our attitudes, baka parati tayong mapaaway. No, like for example, for example, you have a negative attitude towards a certain political view, but what if you met what if you met the father of your significant other, either the father of your boyfriend or the father of your girlfriend, and the father of your significant other exactly has the political view that you are disgusted over. Uh, so how would you behave towards the father? Will you insult the father's ideas? Will you quarrel with the father? Probably not, right? Now, otherwise, say goodbye to your significant other. Okay. Think about experiences in the past wherein, even if you don't like somebody, even if you don't like something or a certain idea, you seem to have behaved opposite your evaluation. Ayaw mo ng sinigang, pero in the past, kumain ka ng sinigang, no? Gusto mo ng ice cream, pero in the past, you also denied yourself of having ice cream. So attitudes do not always equate behavior. No? There are many other factors that come into play. Attitude is one of them, but unfortunately, attitude doesn't seem to be a very powerful predictor of behavior, which might come as a surprise to some of you. Okay. And this is especially true if we're talking about spontaneous behavior. No? Okay. So for spontaneous behavior, attitudes are not good predictors. No? For example, hindi mo naman alam na yung father ng iyong significant other has the political view that you hate, no? And nalaman mo na lang nasa bahay, you're already having dinner, so biglaan, hindi ka prepared, no? So you probably wouldn't act on your attitude. Or for example, ayaw mo ng sinigang, no, in the same dinner, pero yun yung in order. So hindi ka nakapagplano. So most likely, even if you don't like sinigang, mapipilitan ka na kainin yung sinigang, no? Dahil yun yung inihain. Nakakahiya naman kung ay hindi po ako kumakain ng sinigang. Order po kayo ng panibago. Order po kayo ng crispy pata. Yung po kinakain ko. Sinigang, ew. So there, no? But when you talk about planned behavior, when will attitude predict spontaneous behavior? Only if you have a very, very strong attitude towards something. So if it's highly accessible to you. So attitude accessibility refers to the strength of the association between an attitude and an object, and a person's evaluation of that object, measured by the speed with which people can report or feel about the object. So kung talagang napakalakas at napaka-accessible ng iyong negative attitude towards sinigang, then siguro that might that might predict that you will not eat sinigang, or yeah, you would rather order something else. You would rather embarrass yourself. You would rather um, risk that your future father-in-law will be insulted, no, but because you ordered something else, because you didn't like sinigang. Pero if you don't have a very strong attitude towards uh, the object, then probably your attitudes won't predict your behavior. Uh, Now, spontaneous behaviors is one thing, but planned behavior or deliberative behaviors is another thing. Um, the one particular model that is very resilient. I mean, this model of or this theory has been in existence for a very long time. And it's a very well-known theory. It's called the theory of planned behavior by um, sino ba to? Asgen or Eisen, if I'm not mistaken. I'm probably pronouncing the name wrong. So the theory of planned behavior. But even in the theory of planned behavior, so what is that theory of planned behavior? It's a model that explains, in a general sense, uh, why we behave in certain ways that we behave in, and especially for behaviors that are deliberate or planned, not spontaneous. Okay. And partly it talks about attitudes, no? But attitude is not the complete picture, no? Based on the theory of planned behavior. So what does that theory of planned behavior say? It suggests that the best predictors of a person's planned behavior are um, are our intentions. No? So will you buy, or will you eat? Will you dare try to eat wasabi flavored ice cream? Will you? What will you do? Will you attend a BTS concert? That that those behaviors, those are planned behaviors, will be determined by your intentions to do those things. If you have an intention to eat, a certain flavor of ice cream, then the more likely you will do so. If you have the intention to watch a BTS concert, then you will more likely do so. If you have the intention to debate with your future father-in-law, then you have then you're more likely to do so. But where do our intentions come from? Our intentions come from our attitudes. So nandun yung attitude component. But there are other things. Now, another one is subjective norms. And lastly, perceived behavioral control. So the model looks like this. So our behavior is predicted by our behavioral intentions, and our behavioral intentions are influenced by our attitudes. What are attitudes? And take note, hindi lang attitudes. Now, according to the model, it has to be a specific attitude. The more specific the attitude is, the better it can predict. Behavior. Saying that you don't like or that you like ice cream is a general statement of an attitude, no? But if you say I like Magnolia's winter melon flavored ice cream, then that is a more specific attitude. Okay. Subjective norms refers to people's beliefs about how other people they care about will view the behavior in question. Okay. And lastly, perceived behavioral control refers to the ease with which people believe they can perform the behavior. Okay, so going back to our to the example that we have started with, will you? How do you? Okay, so will you? Do you have the intention to raise a debate with with your significant other's father uh, because you oppose his views on politics. So if you have that kind of intention, then you probably would do so. But the question is, before you have the intention, let's be clear about your attitude. Now, what is your specific attitude? So if, let's say, for example, you specifically dislike um, um, uh, how do you call that? So let's say that whatever you specifically dislike about this political opinion, yun yung sinasabi ng father niya. So probably you would have, so if you check that mark, then sige, you probably would have an intention to debate with this individual. However, another thing to consider is subjective norms. Like, what would the people you care about say about the behavior? Will they agree with that? Like, for example, in the middle of the family dinner, how do you think your significant other would feel if you start debating with your future father-in-law? So that would be a consideration. So even if you have a specific negative attitude towards the father's political opinion, however, you know that if you start debating with the guy, ma-hurt naman yung significant other mo, it might cause a commotion, or people around you would disapprove of that behavior, then probably that would lessen your intention. Another thing is perceived behavioral control. The question is, can you do that? Can you debate with that? Pero if you feel that you can't engage in a debate, meaning to say, yes, you have strong dislike about a certain political view, but the question is, are you knowledgeable about the facts, about the possible arguments if you would start a debate? If you feel that you're very competent, then you probably would have the behavioral intention to do so. But if you feel that you make yourself look like a fool because you're not that competent in a debate, or you don't even know what the facts are, then probably that would lessen your behavioral intention. Okay, so as you can see, it's a very convoluted thing. It's a very complicated matter, and attitude actually plays a lesser role than we would think, in terms of forming behavioral intentions and eventually acting on those behaviors. Okay. All right. This particular model has been used in a lot of research, not only in psychology, in medicine, in physical education, like questions such as what would predict adherence to medication or adherence to a certain physical exercise routine, or a bunch of behaviors. Now, this model has been used, and time again. The evidence are suggesting that there is a lot of support to this model, with one slight uh, variation. The succeeding studies, the more recent studies, are also suggesting that aside from the indirect effect of perceived behavioral control on behavior via behavioral intention, some studies are also suggesting that perceived behavioral control might also have a direct impact on behavior. Okay. All right. So yun lang yung parang update na sa model. Okay. So we've already talked about what attitudes are. We've talked about the components of attitudes. We've clarified that some attitudes are more cognitive, more affective, more behavioral. And we've also pointed out that attitudes are not always good predictors of behavior, especially those that are spontaneous. And if attitudes were to predict planned non-spontaneous behaviors, we have to consider very specific attitudes. And even with that, we still have to consider other factors such as perceived social norms and perceived behavioral control. Another question is how stable are attitudes? Do our attitudes change them? I suppose that some of you might feel that it's relatively stable. Our likes and dislikes don't necessarily fluctuate all the time, but we also have to recognize the fact that it's possible that our attitudes change. It's quite possible that you like someone now, but that doesn't guarantee that you like the person till the end of time. It's we're very familiar with experiences of of liking somebody one day and completely hating that person uh, uh, in a future time. Sometimes there are certain objects that we do not like for example, if like I don't like in the beginning, I really didn't like the brand of laptop that I have, no, but because I was sort of pressured to buy the laptop that I have now, I tried it and I like my laptop now, no. So attitudes change, no, all the time. When a clear example of how attitudes change would be in terms of the ratings of politicians, and they fluctuate all the time. Some politicians have high ratings at the beginning of their term, then it dips. If something good happens in the economy, the approval rating rises again, and so forth and so on. So attitudes change. And because we know attitudes, sometimes we are also in the position wherein we try to change the attitudes of others. Like it's a very common experience for us to try to convince somebody to buy a certain product. We try to convince somebody to enroll in a certain course. We try to convince somebody to invest in a certain stock or invest in a certain business. We have tried to convince other people not to do certain things. Wag mo na siyang awayin, wag mo na siyang pagalitan. We've tried some individuals to be on our side, no, on a certain political opinion. No? So sometimes we're in the position wherein we want to change other people's attitude, and at other times, other people are trying to change our attitude, right? When your counselor talks to you, when your parents talk to you, when we watch advertisements. That's why that's my question, my discussion question. Like, what advertisements do you think influenced you the most? or I think the how I phrased it was, what advertisements do you think were very effective? And by effective, that means to say that somehow it changed your attitude towards the product that is being advertised. So how does, attitude change? Partly we've discussed already some of the mechanisms, and in the previous in the previous module we've talked about dissonance, and how when people say something that is really the opposite of their beliefs, it creates dissonance. And if they don't have any good external justification for saying something, such as writing or delivering a speech that remember yung hypocrisy paradigm that goes against what they're doing, it creates dissonance. And if they don't have a good external attribution, they might have to internally modify their beliefs. And modifying their beliefs is, in fact, a form of attitude change. So attitudes can change through the experience of dissonance and people's attempts to reduce those dissonance by changing their cognitions or attitudes towards a certain individual, object, or idea. Okay, so that's one. Okay, so that's what we refer to as counter-attitudinal advocacy. Another one, and probably a more obvious answer, is attitudes change through persuasive communication. And this is partly what I was talking about a while ago. Like, several times we do this, and we try to convince or persuade other people into liking or disliking someone, something, or an idea. Okay. So when we say persuasive communication, this refers to communication such as a speech or a television ad or a spiel or a monologue on our part. Now we're trying to we're trying to sell an idea to somebody, a friend maybe, or our parent. Ginagawa niyo ba yun? Like, for example, when you wanna buy something, ibinibenta nyo, you're trying to sell the idea of buying something to your dad or to your mom. And like, what were your attempts to convince them? Ano yung mga arguments na pinresent niyo? Like, for example, you really want to have the latest cell phone. Your cell phone is dilapidated. You want to buy a new one. Your dad won't budge, and then you're trying to convince your dad, sige na dad, nabila mo na ako ng bagong cellphone. How did you communicate how did you deliver your persuasive communication? Was there a grand speech that you delivered over at dinner? Did you lay down? May PowerPoint presentation ba? May bullet points? Ba't mo ako kailangan bilhan ng bagong cellphone? Okay, so if you are the one who's trying to convince a certain audience, how will you construct your message and your delivery, in order to affect change in the attitude of these individuals? Much of our knowledge about persuasive communication, much of the evidence is brought to us by a certain program at Yale University. There's a group of social scientists, a group of psychologists who had a series of studies about this exact topic, about persuasive communication, and all of its elements, who said what to whom. They've studied the source of communication, the nature of communication, the nature of the audience. And this program is referred to as the Yale Attitude Change Approach, because it was spearheaded by professors from Yale University. So it's a series of studies, and their principal interest is to examine the conditions under which people are most likely to engage in their change rather no, in their attitudes in response to persuasive message. And what have they learned? All right. According to the likelihood model, which I suppose was partly used no, in their research, no, there are two ways by which persuasive communication can cause attitude change. The elaboration likelihood model is, I think, originated by Petty and Kakyopo. Okay. And these two routes of possible persuasion is through the central route, no, route ba or route, or the peripheral route. Wait, let me pause the video. How do you pronounce this? Route or route? Okay, so I figured it out. Wait.
Route. Route.
Route daw. Okay. Sabi na YouTube, route.
He seemed absent as we planned the route for the day's expedition.
Okay. Recording na ba? Okay. So, central route to persuasion and peripheral route to persuasion. So, central route, when people are motivated and have the ability to pay attention to the arguments, then that is the central route to persuasion. So what is this? So if you're the audience, somebody is delivering a persuasive communication, perhaps a certain school official is trying to convince you of a certain policy, and you listen to the arguments, or for example, you're delivering your persuasive communication to your dad on why he has to buy you a new phone, and your dad, listens to your bullets of arguments, then your dad is taking the central route to persuasion. Okay. The peripheral route to persuasion, on the other hand, by the way, when do we pay attention to the arguments? When we are motivated, and when we have the ability to pay attention. Peripheral route, on the other hand, is when people are swayed by the persuasive communication, but they're not really swayed by the arguments, but by the surface characteristics of the communication. May mga speakers, may mga tao na nagde-deliver ng persuasive communication who delivers very long speeches, and they speak very eloquently, and then you were told that this is a distinguished professor who has several doctoral degrees, most of them from abroad and from Ivy League universities. So sa credentials pa lang, and then mukha naman siyang talagang kamukha ni Sigmund Freud na yung nag-deliver ng speech na. So sometimes if we don't, if we're not really interested in the arguments, pwedeng at face value mag-agree na tayo, mabago na yung attitude natin. Pero ang basis lang natin ay yung mga superficial, mga surface characteristics. This is also partly why sa mga advertisements, kinukuha nila yung mga celebrity endorsers. No? So that's taking advantage of the peripheral route to persuasion. No? So basta sinabi na BTS, bumili ng McDo meal, na-advertise nila parang may McDo meal na go, sabi ng BTS ayan, sa peripheral route to persuasion. Ano pa ba mga peripheral cues? Credibility, attractiveness of the speaker, so those are other peripheral cues. Okay. So central route to persuasion, the case whereby people elaborate on persuasive communication, you listen to and think about the arguments, as occurs when people have both the ability and the motivation to listen to the communication carefully. So when are we more likely to engage in the central route to persuasion? Number one, if we have the motivation, if it's very relevant to us. Kung hindi naman siya relevant to us, probably we won't pay much attention sa mga arguments and we'll just agree on the basis of, surface characteristics of the speaker or of the event. No? And second, even if we're motivated, sometimes we're just tired. The relevant sa atin, pero yung mga terms very technical, hindi natin maintindihan. No? So that limits our ability to understand the persuasive communication. So, but if it's relevant, naiintindihan mo, hindi ka pagod, you can focus and attend to the arguments. Then we are taking the central route to persuasion. However, if we are persuaded simply because of peripheral cues, length of speech, eloquentness of how eloquent the speaker is, yung degree ng speaker, attractiveness, etc., etc., then we're taking the peripheral route to persuasion. All right. So nasabi ko na to, the more personally relevant the topic is, the more we pay attention, and the more we take central route to persuasion. Okay. All right. So here is the result of a study, and there are two factors. One is three factors pala, no? So personal relevance, so merong high personal relevance, low personal relevance. Another factor is expertise, no? So low source expertise, high source expertise, and so that's yung peripheral cues, no? And strength of arguments. So yung red line, na yung strong arguments, and yung blue line, yan naman yung weak arguments. So saan pinakamataas ang agreement? Pinakamataas ang agreement. One, of course, obviously, kapag high yung personal relevance, wait lang. Ano bang maganda i-point out dito? Okay. So take a look at this na dito sa, let's annotate. So focus your attention here. Okay. So if it's low relevance, you will notice that when the arguments are weak, itong blue line, they relied more on, or the agreement is based more on the peripheral cues, which is yung high expertise. So the more the higher the expertise of the speaker, the more they agree, as opposed to yung low expertise. And then if it's highly relevant, you will see that whether the speaker has low expertise or high expertise, mapapansin ninyo na all of these individuals, regardless of the expertise, showed agreement, especially if the arguments were strong, and showed disagreement when the arguments are weak, regardless kung the one who's delivering the speech is an expert or not an expert. All right. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so some individuals have a high need for cognition. No? May mga tao who are really inclined to to think, to listen, no? And these individuals are more likely to take the central route to persuasion. But for people who have low need for cognition, then they're more likely to take the peripheral route to persuasion. Okay, so we've talked about this already. Now the next question is, which is better, or which results to long-lasting attitude change? Is it the attitude change caused by the central by going through the central route to persuasion, or is it the change in attitude by via persuasive route to persuasion? So according to studies, people who base their attitudes on a careful analysis of the arguments, say central route to persuasion, will be more likely to maintain this attitude, more likely to behave consistently with this attitude, and are more likely to be resistant to counter persuasions in the future. So if you will attempt to deliver persuasive communication, what are some of the things that you should consider? One, because we want a more lasting attitude change, we, as much as possible, we want our audience to take the central route to persuasion. But why would they, or how, or when will they take the central route to persuasion? We have to consider that. No? It is said that they will take the central route to persuasion if the topic is relevant to them. So that's a consideration. So we have to make, or we have to impress upon them that this is relevant. I'm not exactly sure how we can do that. I suppose there are certain means by which we can do that, but we have to impress upon them that this is relevant to you. Second, so if it's relevant, then they would attend to the arguments. If they attend to the arguments, well, another way for them to attend to the arguments is that they should have the ability to comprehend. No? So take a time of the day na hindi sila pagod. No. Take a time of make sure that the venue is comfortable. Wala masyadong distractions. Kung maraming distractions, they won't attend to your arguments, to your persuasive arguments. So make sure that the situation is conducive for them to be able to listen to the arguments. And third, make sure that you have strong arguments. Okay, so you want to convince your dad to buy you a new phone? One, impress upon your dad that, dad, this decision is relevant to you. How do you do that? Ang kaligayahan, dad, ng nag-iisa mong anak ay nakasalalay sa desisyon na ito. Mahal mo ba ako, dad? So, relevant na siya. Second, dapat yung timing tama na. So, make sure na so dali mo si dad mo sa garden, wala masyadong distraction. May mga distracting things ba sa garden? Anyway, so somewhere. Pagkatapos, yung hindi siya pagod, yung kaya niya mag-focus. Wag mo sabihin yan kapag nanonood siya ng basketball. Wag mo sabihin yan pag galing siya sa trabaho na pagod siya. So maybe on a Saturday morning, wag siguro during breakfast na baka masarap yung breakfast, distracted siya. So there. And third, dapat solid yung iyong arguments. No? gumawa ka ng PowerPoint presentation if you have to. No? So dapat solid yung arguments. No? So with those, yeah. So congratulations on your new phone for Christmas. All right. Okay. So sana nakatulong. Okay. Next, emotion and attitude change. O baka may maitulong pa ako dito, no? So another factor that we have to consider in attitude change is what's the role of our emotions, and if okay, what's the role of our emotions? One particular emotion that is used for persuasive communication is fear. So there is such a thing as called fear arousing communication. So these are persuasive messages that attempts to change people's attitudes by arousing fear. So in advertising, I guess ginagamit din ito, no? Like for example, yung mga cigarette packs ngayon, merong mga fear-inducing images, right? Yung mga, di ba may mga models no, sa mga cigarette packs na lang ng tao na merong emphysema, patient na merong throat cancer, no, stuff like that. So that is designed to arouse fear. No? And sometimes when we are trying to convince somebody, sometimes we also use that. Tinatakot natin sila. We probably have talked about what are the possible consequences kapag ginawa mo to. No? Hindi ka ba natatakot? No? Stuff like that. And we probably have been also at the receiving end of being threatened ba yun? Parang people have tried to arouse fear in us in order to convince us to change our attitude. Are they effective? To some extent, yes. One, how will they be effective? Number one, the amount of fear that you induce should be moderate. Kapag masyadong nakakatakot yung iyong message or yung iyong method of arousing fear, if it's very extreme, then people tend to sort of be defensive, and when people are defensive, then they won't listen to your arguments anymore. They'll shut themselves off. And another would be if there is information on how to reduce fear. So it's not effective to simply arouse fear. Dapat meron ding educational part, which would allow them to reduce their fear. So they did an experiment. This is about smoking. So they were trying to. This was an intervention for people who are smoking. Ano ba nakalagay dito sa ating x-axis? Average number of cigarettes smoked per day. So before the experiment, so ito yung ating nasaan ba yun? Wait. So ito yung average number of cigarettes. So walang significant difference. And then there are three conditions. So one, merong film, but no instruction. So the film talked about the horrors of the horrible consequences of sorry. Ito pala yan. So film, no instruction. So merong video na pinakita about the horrible consequences of smoking. May condition din na no film, instruction lang. So may pamphlet na binigay. And then merong, so yung pamphlet, yun yung parang educational tool on how to stop smoking. And then merong optimal combination, which is a combination of may film na, so tinakot mo na sila, and then afterwards they were given a pamphlet on how they can stop smoking. And what they learned was the most effective was the combination of film, and instruction. So pag film lang, tinakot mo lang, but they don't have a way to sort of, like, you didn't instruct them on how to reduce their fear, walang instruction on how to stop smoking, then it's bumaba, pero not that much, pero yung tinakot tapos merong pamphlet, you will notice itong blue line na there was a steady decline, well, not really a steady decline, but there was a significant decline in the number of cigarettes smoked per day. Pero yung instruction lang na parang yung pamphlet lang ang binigay, parang tumaas pa nga na yung kanilang smoking. So there, so fear arousing communication can be effective, at least that's what the evidence say, especially if it is coupled with education that can help the person reduce the fear, by doing a certain set of behaviors. So yeah, make sure that it's moderate. Why? Because strong amounts of fear may overwhelm people. They may become defensive. They deny the importance of the threat, and they can no longer think rationally about the issue. So hindi rin magiging successful yung iyong mga arguments. And yeah, yung educational tool. Emotions are also important in relation to our attitudes, because sometimes the way how we feel, our mood is sometimes used as a heuristic. Ano ba yung heuristic? Parang shortcut, when we're trying to sort of evaluate something. Do I like a certain product? For example, do I like a certain shirt or a certain pair of jeans, a certain pair of sneakers? Sometimes we rely on how we feel about them. So we call that as ano man tawag dun? Emotion heuristic. I forgot the term. I forget the term that was used in the book. Ayan. So if we feel good about the object, then we might conclude that maybe we have a positive attitude about that particular object. Now, if we feel bad, then that might tell us that we have a negative attitude towards the object. But the thing is, sometimes the way we feel is not really because of the objects that we're saying. If we're in a mall and we're looking for a pair of jeans, we're already in a good mood to begin with. So when we fit a pair of jeans and we seem to be in a good mood, that might sort of tell us that that we have a positive attitude towards those pair of jeans. And so it's not surprising na some malls talagang they try to make you feel as much as possible as good as possible. They try, like for example, air condition, lalo na ngayon kapag nagpunta kayo sa mall, over the PA system, Christmas songs are playing. Nakaka good mood din naman yun, di ba? Like pagpasok mo sa mall, kumakanta si Jose Marie Chan. So, parang there's sort of a parang giving spirit, kaya nga siguro effective din yun, na kapag pumalo na September, malls start playing Christmas songs, to put people in a good mood, to buy stuff. So when they're trying on or when they're looking at a pair of sneakers, and the weather outside is kumakanta na yung Christmas songs, so pwedeng maengganyo sila na bumili ng mga products. Okay, Okay. Um, when we're trying to change somebody's attitudes, another thing to consider is now for us to be aware what kind of attitude are we trying to change. No? Kasi as what we have discussed a while ago, some attitudes are more affectively based, while some attitudes are more um, cognitively based. No? So it might also be a good idea to fight fire with fire, meaning to say, if the attitude is cognitively based, no, then we can try to change it, no, through rational arguments. No? But if the attitude is more affectively based, no, then we can try to change it, no, through emotional appeal. So there is also merit, no, to that. Um, okay. So, for example, some ads stress the objective merits of a product, no? Price, reliability, efficiency. If you'll notice sa mga TV shopping na they're very big on this, no. Parati ng but wait, there's more, no. So they try to demo the product, show you things it can do, talk about its price, no, and talk about yung mga other stuff, no, mga freebies na kasama nung product, no. So it's very um, very rational, no? Very argument centric, no? And this might be very useful, no, for like what I said, things that we typically would have cognitively based attitudes towards, which are, utilitarian objects. No? However, some ads stress emotion and values. When, for example, cosmetic products, you wouldn't find ads that talks about cosmetic products, and they lay down, although siguro merong konti, no, but for the most part, no, for cosmetic products, they appeal more to your emotions, no, to emotions of people, or for example, advertisement for clothing, hindi naman nila dinidiscuss kung anong klaseng fabric yon, or kung kung saan factory ba yung ginawa, no. And most of the advertisements about clothing also target, emotions, no, and values, and that's because advertisers know that our attitude towards clothing is more affectively based, while tama, di ba? Parang for the most part, we buy clothes that look good on us. Siguro partly we also consider the fabric or the material, but I think the number one priority is like how does this make me feel? No? Do I look good on it? No? Whereas if we're buying products that are utilitarian, then or for products that are utilitarian, then advertisements can also focus on logical arguments about its usefulness. And they made a study about this as well. So you will notice, ano ba to? So there are two products. I just don't know what products those are. So one is a product that is utilitarian. So if you will have a positive attitude towards it, it will be cognitively based. And the other product is affective, has something to do with your social identity. And you will notice that the favorable thoughts on these products are contingent on whether or not they the way the advertisements were cognitively or affective effective. No? So kung if the advertisement resulted to more favorable thoughts for cognitively based advertisements result to more favorable thoughts for products that are utilitarian, but not so much for affectively based products. And affectively based ads appealed more or resulted to more favorable thoughts for affectively based products rather than cognitively based or utilitarian products. Ayan. So when you're trying to convince somebody, then that's something to consider. Do you think that the attitude in question is more cognitive or more affective? And play your cards well, depending on your knowledge about these attitudes. Okay. Culture also is a factor in terms of how advertisers appeal to their audience. What do you notice about advertisements here in the Philippines? Some of the responses in our discussion question, I think I saw parang marami nagsabi ng Jollibee commercials. And what do you notice about the commercials in the Philippines? Like for example, yung weird RC Cola commercial, or in a Jollibee commercial, or even McDonald's. A lot of the advertisements in the Philippines is very family and relationship centric, right? Na maraming mga and even Thai advertisements, right? Na sa maraming mga advertisements about mother and father, mag-asawa, mag-boyfriend, magkaibigan na naging mag-boyfriend, na naging magkaibigan uli. It's very relationship centric. Whereas and even yung mga medyo quote-unquote masculine advertisement, parang they still appeal to relationships like barkada, tropa, ganun. But in Western culture, you will notice that the ads appeal more to individuality and self-improvement. A very classic American, a very classic Western advertisement. Although hindi nyo na siguro inabutan, kasi nung pinanganak kayo, most likely bawal na ang mga advertisements para sa sigarilyo. But there was a time wherein, cigarette companies and alcoholic beverage companies, like for example, San Miguel Beer, were allowed to air and advertise through print. And one of these companies, an American-based company, is Marlboro, which is a cigarette brand. At yung image of a Marlboro brand appeals to individuality. Typically, ang advertisement ito would involve a lonesome cowboy. Mag-isa lang siya, and then maraming kabayo. So it the advertisement truly classically appeals to individuality and independence and autonomy. Okay. All right. Another thing that influences our attitude change is sometimes we also, ang tawag dito, our body state also influences our attitude change. They had a very interesting study, and you can see the results here. So ang kanilang cover story is that they recruited participants, and the participants were told that they were they will test headphones, no. And especially they were gonna test kung gaano katibay yung headphones, no. So habang suot nila yung headphone, some of them were instructed to rock their heads back and forth like that, which of course is parang, the nodding movement. And of course, nodding is associated with agreement, right? And then another group were asked to twist their head sideways. No. Pero ang cover story is parang matibay ba yung headphone. No? So they were nodding. Which is associated with saying no, right? No, if you swing your face, your head side to side. But while they're wearing their headphones, merong a certain audio is piped in. No? And I'm not exactly sure what the topic was, but parang it's a persuasive argument. And on half of the participants, the arguments were strong, and on half of the arguments of the participants, the arguments were weak. No. And what is surprising is that for the head nodding group, when the arguments were strong, the agreement with the persuasive message is very high. Okay. As opposed to yung head shaking. Na. And then, so parang habang naririnig nila yung strong arguments, no, while they're nodding their head, so parang they're sort of agreeing that the arguments are strong. So talagang kailangan ko mag-nod ng head, no? Resulting to agreement, no, with the persuasive message. However, when the arguments were weak and they were nodding, you will notice that the agreement was almost very low. So parang they were nodding to the weakness of the argument, and so a lot of them did not agree with the message. So yeah, anyway, now read the book, no, for you to sort of completely appreciate the experiment. So, but it's interesting, no, how without us knowing, we also take cues from our head. Meron pa nga na experiments about parang forcing people to smile by making them by placing maybe a pencil, no, sa bibig nila. Wala akong pencil dito, no, but if you have a pencil, parang it's sort of forcing your facial muscles to parang it activates muscles that are typically used for smiling. And parang there is some evidence that when you do that, people generate positive attitudes towards certain objects. So yun, no? Maybe you can look for studies like those, no, if you're interested in. Okay. Next. Another thing to consider when you're trying to persuade somebody is that make sure that your attempt at persuasion is not very restrictive. No, people have the need to feel autonomous and independent. And according to the reactance theory, when people feel their freedom to perform a certain behavior is threatened, an unpleasant state of reactance is aroused, and which they can reduce them by performing the threatened behavior. So if you're trying to convince somebody not to do something, wag masyadong extreme yung attempt ninyo, no? Kasi the more you force ideas onto people to the point that they feel that they don't have freedom, the more that they would react, no, and do exactly what you don't want them to do. They did an experiment about this So there were two bathrooms, I think. Um, in one bathroom, they wrote parang a reminder, which is very strong, something like never ever write anything on this wall. No. Tapos dun sa isa namang bathroom, same type of bathroom, ang message na nilagay nila ay please do not write on the wall. So yung isa very restrictive, no, don't you dare, no, don't ever write anything on this bathroom. Pero yung isa medyo mas mild, no, please don't write on the walls. And after a week, I think, or a month, you know what happened? Doon sa very restrictive yung messaging, ang daming sulat. So, so yung mga tao felt that parang sobrang pinagbabawalan kami, gagawin ko yung pinagbabawa sa akin. Whereas yung mild reminder lang na parang please, no, don't write. I'm not sure kung walang writing or kung merong writing man, hindi kasing dami doon sa other condition. So, if you're trying to convince somebody, like, don't get in their faces and don't make them feel as if they don't have a choice. Remember, the most effective way to persuade somebody is parang persuasion, is or attempts at attitude change is more effective, especially when people don't feel that they're being forced to change their attitudes. People want to feel that their attitude change is something that is of their own doing, something that they did voluntarily after considering arguments and reason. Okay, so don't force the issue towards somebody. Otherwise, your attempts will just backfire. All right. Next. At the beginning of this lecture, we asked ourselves, are advertisements effective? And the short answer is yes. Particularly for new products. Effective ads work quickly, increasing sales substantially. Within the first 6 months they were shown. So this is the evidence that have been gathered. More importantly, ads are effective because they try to appeal, or they try to. Ads are effective, especially if the advertisement is relevant to us. And we've learned that from the Yale attitude change approach. So the more relevant something to us, the more likely we will pay attention to the arguments, and if they are convincing, then that will influence our attitude. But what if the product is not really relevant to us? Now, what do advertisers do? What advertisers do is they try to sell the idea. No, not only they don't only try to sell the product, but first and foremost, they try to sell the idea that this is relevant to you. Let's take, for example, Listerine. So you know the story of Listerine. Listerine is, of course, we know what Listerine is. Now, we know it to be a mouthwash, right? Now, however, it didn't really originated as a mouthwash. It was an oral antiseptic, which probably means that you only use this, used by the dentist now when they try to cleanse your mouth. Now before you undergo a dental procedure. But they try to market it as a mouthwash. So they created a new product. The only problem is, what does this product do? They created the solution, and so they had to invent the problem. And so they they try to appeal, or they try to make Listerine relevant to their customers through this ad. No? So if you're familiar with the phrase "often a bridesmaid, never a bride," that was actually taken from this original advertisement of Listerine. So nakalagay yan, Listerine antiseptic stops bad breath. No? So what is the implication? So why is the lady often a bridesmaid but never a bride? No? So ang message ay, kung hindi ka gagamit ng Listerine, chances are you have bad breath, and if you have bad breath, nobody will like you, and you will never be a bride, no? Only a bridesmaid. At least may friends ka pa, no? Kasi meron, at least nakuha ka na bridesmaid. And they even, I'm not sure if it's shown here, but they even went as far as using a rather, at that time at least, no, a rather ambiguous term, which is halitosis. They parang hindi lang sila na-satisfied sa unpleasant breath or bad breath. No? They have to make it sound like really a sort of a medical problem. At may pangalan siya, no? At medyo nakakatakot yung pangalan niya, no? Halitosis. And so there, no? So Listerine made, or at least in their advertisement, no, they try to convince their soon-to-be customers that, this is a very big deal. Hindi ito makukuha ng toothbrush at toothpaste lang, at kailangan nyo kami, no? Kailangan nyo ng Listerine. And this is relevant to you, no? Otherwise, if you don't listen to us, hala ka, baka forever ka ng bridesmaid, no? Or forever ka ng groomsman, at never kang maging husband or bride. Ayan. So that's how the advertisement works. Another interesting topic to be discussed is the topic of subliminal messages. So apparently, advertisers use subliminal messaging. Apparently, in this ad, somewhere in this image, there is the word sex. Can you find the word sex? But apparently meron daw dyan. Although of course, dahil subliminal nga siya, we can't perceive it. Ano ba ang subliminal message? How is it defined? So these are words or pictures that are not consciously perceived by, but may nevertheless, but are there, no, and may nevertheless influence people's judgments, attitudes, and behaviors. But are they effective? So far, the stand of social psychology is that there is no evidence that the type of subliminal messages encountered in everyday life now can influence people's behaviors. However, there are some evidence in highly controlled laboratory experiments. So meron, sorry, and even if there are, probably the influence is hindi naman, hindi siya ganun ka-significant, no, or kalakas. Plus, how things happen in the real world is very different from how things happen in a highly controlled environment. No? So while there is some evidence that subliminal messaging might be effective in controlled environments like a laboratory, for the most part, social psychologists do not find any strong reason to believe that they are effective in the context of advertisements. Okay. Advertising also has something to do with propagating cultural stereotypes, and social behavior. Advertisements transmit cultural stereotypes in their words, images, subtly linking products with desired images. Our idea of beauty is informed by advertisements. There was a time na maraming, I'm not sure right now, but there was a time na uh, a lot of people felt felt bad about their body image, no, because uh, in the early 2000s, the models that were used in ads were you know very thin, very thin women, no? So yung standard of beauty then, no, um, was that, no? And because of that, no, there were a lot of teenagers who felt insecure about their body image. I'm just not sure how it is now. I think uh, probably there has been improvements in terms of how we celebrate different types of bodies. Pero back then, parang there was a an observation that medyo dumadami yung cases of anorexia nervosa, and they attribute it, to the propagation of these sometimes unrealistic cultural standards. Um, Advertisements can also reinforce stereotypical ways, of thinking about social groups. Ayun. Like for example, in America, hindi masyadong positive yung perception sa mga advertisements featuring biracial families. Ayan. Okay. So gender stereotypes are also sometimes propagated, through advertising. The ideas that men are depicted as doers and women are depicted as observers. That also is propagated, by advertising. Although I suppose nowadays siguro may mga pagbabago na naman, may mga changes na naman. Okay. All right. So we've now talked about how we can influence others and what are some of the conditions and factors that we might consider if we want to change other people's attitude. But sometimes we also want to protect our attitudes because we don't want to be influenced by others, especially if the influence is a negative influence. No, we don't want to develop attitudes, or like for example positive attitudes towards vices or towards drugs. But so how do we protect ourselves? We don't want ourselves to be influenced by another political opinion. So how do we protect ourselves from attitude change? If we want to hold on to our attitude. So one way is through attitude inoculation. So inoculation is, I guess, a very fitting term nowadays, now that we're in the middle of a pandemic. So inoculation is another word for vaccination. So attitude inoculation works pretty much like a vaccine. How is it? So the mechanism is making people immune to attempts to change their attitudes by initially exposing them to small doses of arguments against their position. So if you've changed somebody's attitude and you want that attitude to be resistant to future attitude change, you can already inoculate them. Like for example, nakumbinsi mo na sila. So you can give them, or you can expose them to counter arguments. Pwedeng sabihin ng iba na ganito, ganyan. Subalit, so by exposing them to small doses of counter arguments, that builds, ano bang ginagawa ng vaccine? No? Parang it builds defenses. No? So more than changing their attitudes, you're also equipping them on how to defend those attitudes against potential counter arguments. So that's what you refer to as attitude inoculation. Okay. If we don't want to be influenced by advertisements, and sometimes the more effective advertisements are the ones that are inconspicuous, the ones which we are not prepared for, the ones which we're not even aware that we're being targeted, no? Such as product placements. Di ba uso yan ngayon, no? Right, well, kakatapos ko lang namin panoorin yung Hometown Cha-Cha-Cha. At ang dami mga product placements no, sa Hometown Cha-Cha-Cha. If you've watched it, like for example, Copico, no? And Domino's Pizza. Okay. So if you want to protect yourselves against this, being aware that there are product placements can also be an effective way of preventing or protecting ourselves against attitude change or against persuasive attempts. Okay. And yeah, what about resisting peer pressure? So to make adolescents resistant to attitude change attempts via peer pressure, attitude inoculation that focuses on inoculating against emotional appeals is also a good way to do that. So if you have brothers and sisters who are about to go to high school and you're worried that they might be targeted in terms of peer pressure, then you can already warn them of what to expect and how their peers might try to convince them to do something foolish or illegal. So you can already prepare them by inoculating them through role playing. Actually, that's very effective, no? So mag-role play kayo, no? Anong gagawin mo kapag inoferan ka manigarilyo? Anong gagawin mo kapag inoferan ka mag-drugs ng mga barkada mo? How do you refuse that? No? So role playing is a very effective way of attitude inoculation. Okay. All right. Meron pa ba? Wala na. So that is it about attitude and attitude change. Okay, so hopefully you've learned quite a few things. I guess this particular lesson is very important because in the future we might be in the position wherein we need to convince people to take a certain position or change their attitudes on something. So I hope that these things will be useful to you in terms of future roles that you might take as a parent, as an employee, as a manager, as a program developer, as a clinician. So there, and based on what we've discussed, what do you think are interesting areas of research that you want to explore and further examine in terms of the fascinating world of attitude and attitude change? Okay, so that's it. Thank you very much for listening. If you've finished the entire episode, kudos to you. Congratulations. Thank you very much, and I will see you next week. Bye.